Hey, good morning. Hey, if you're new, if you're joining us online or you're here in the room, really glad that you're here. I'm Charlie, the lead pastor. Really glad all of you are worshiping with us today. And if you've been around the last couple of weeks, you know that we're in the process of claiming some new space on the east side of the building. And we've been raising some money for that, and in an incredibly fast amount of time, raised all kind of essentially the one-time capital that we needed for the project. And people have continued to give to that as kind of the larger that pot increases, the more we've been able to do, and just kind of dreaming about projects, including placing carpet in here and some upgrades to our cafe, some great things like that. And we're also trying to kind of shore up our week-to-week budget, and really appreciate everybody who's done that. We've been wanting to increase that by about $5,000 a month. And so far, we've gotten commitments for about 1,500 of that, which is really good. And I just encourage everybody to, even if there's a sense in which where it feels a little anticlimactic, like the bulk of the work is already done, I just really encourage everybody to still consider being a part of this project with giving and your financial support. So I think this is going to be a great season in our church. I think what's going to happen with our roots and with our kids ministry and our opportunity to serve our community, it's just going to grow. And it's just one of these things, it's almost like I'm the coach. And it's like, man, we want everybody on the team to feel like that they contributed. And we don't want any of us really to have a mindset of, man, I'm really glad that those people did that. And that we want to have this sense in which we were all involved. I think there is some really tangible and intangible benefits for you and your participation here in the church. And so I just ask you, just continue to pray about your support, both in the one time and in the ongoing. And we are really excited about this project. The owners are still kind of working on all their repairs, which is really good. I mean, just from a real practical standpoint, the more repairs and things that they do, there's just less cost for us, which has been really good. And so we're hoping to be able to get in there and do our part pretty soon, but we'll just continue to keep you updated on that. So one thing I was thinking about this week, and my brain just kind of goes to weird places different times. Like there's this awkward thing that happens to me. Maybe I don't know if you can help me with it, or maybe we're just kind of talking about it. It's like when I see somebody who's new to the church, my instinct is that I just want to go talk to them. I want to go talk to them and say hi and welcome, because I don't want anybody to feel like they're on the outside. But then I go and talk to them. I'm telling you, and 9 times out of 10, I'm talking to somebody, hey, and they just kind of go. And I feel like, man, I'm clearly making them uncomfortable. And I'm like, I think I'm a moderately attractive guy. I mean, like, I don't, what is it? And then I realize it's the headset mic. It's the headset mic. Headset mic guy is now coming to talk to me. And there's just something about it. It's like, oh, that guy, right? And it's like, And now I've noticed, as I've talked to new people, that almost like a really large percentage of new people will not only check out the website and all these things, but will watch at least a couple of sermons. And so they already know who I am. And so me approaching them is like, it's the lead guy. And I was like, and so now I've kind of got this thing that I'm trying to do is like, I want a new person to know that we're really glad they're here, that I in particular am glad they're here, but I'm also not trying to make anybody feel uncomfortable. Especially someone that's new. I want someone that's new to feel like that they can come in and belong, like it says there on the outside of the wall. You can belong here, but no one wants to be just highlighted. Hey, you're clearly new. I'm the lead pastor, right? And so I don't want anybody to feel that, because honestly, I mean, I feel this, and I want to just kind of empower you with it too, that there's like, no one wants to be on the outside. No one does. You don't want to be on the outside. You want to come here and feel like, then whatever way kind of vibes with you and your personality, you want to come here and feel like, hey man, this is my place. And so I want you to feel like that's kind of what we're supposed to be about, because really that's what God's people are supposed to be doing. And if you read through the Old Testament, you'll just see it over and over again all throughout. There's one phrase in particular that always stands out where God says, and be very mindful of widows, orphans, and depending on your translation, it'll say alien or stranger. For our sense, it would be, our word would be immigrant. the foreigner, someone who is out. So it's like, and all of those people, the thing that they have in common is they really are kind of on the outside of, let's say, just kind of normal economic life of the country. They don't have their own land that they can work. And so they're kind of on the outside. And he's like, you always want to be incredibly mindful of the people who are on the outside. Because you remember being in Egypt when you were on the outside. And you being on the outside there felt like a punishment. We want it to feel like the outside here, that they're blessed. And so that kind of ties us in there to kind of this story, like the big picture story of God. That's who God's people are supposed to be. That's who Jesus is, who is going out to the people who are outside and wanting to bring them in. And we end up here now in the story of Ruth. This is the third week we've been here, and we learn about Ruth. And interesting about her, widow, orphan, foreigner, essentially in her status, she's all three. This family from Israel was in Moab for a season, and she marries into it. And then their patriarch, the dad, he dies. And so essentially they become orphans. And then the husbands die. Now she's a widow. And now then she moves there, her and her mother-in-law, Naomi, they move back to Israel. So now they're orphaned, they're widowed, and now she's a foreigner because she's from Moab. And so she is all three of these things. But she is incredibly commended, and so therefore becomes a very unlikely hero in this story. To be on the outside in every way and to be the hero of a story is very countercultural for the people who are reading this. And then she shows such tremendous devotion to God, to her mother-in-law. She loves so well. And we see that in the first chapter when she says she's going to stick with her. And then in the second chapter when Naomi says to her, it's like, hey, in order for us to eat, you're going to have to go gather. And essentially Ruth says, hey, whatever it is you think that we need to do, I will do anything that I can to love and serve you. And just over and over again, we see her dedication to God, and we see her commitment and love for her mother-in-law. And then last week, this guy named Boaz enters the story. When Ruth went out to gather food, she ends up in the fields of this guy named Boaz. And again, by obviously God's design, ends up in his field. And he's essentially a cousin of her father-in-law's family. And so he has they have a special connection together. And God designed this. And we see Boaz just kind of taking note of her and showing her extra kindness. And so, to kind of recap some of this, we're going to talk a lot more about Boaz today and his role in this story. We're going to recap some of the things we looked at last week, and then we're going to look at chapter 3 a little bit later. In Ruth chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, when he discovers that Ruth is gathering in his field, he says this to her: "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." So essentially he says, hey, I want you to be in my field. Don't go anywhere else. We'll make sure we'll take care of you. Nothing bad is going to happen to you here. You just gather the way you're supposed to. And this was actually in the Old Testament law. This was what was expected of landowners. Be mindful of widows, orphans, and foreigners because they don't have any land of their own. You want to make sure you are the type of guy who you don't want to gather up all of your foods. Like, and if you drop anything, gather it all up and make sure that everything that belongs to you, you get. Don't be like that. You want to make sure that anything that you drop, you leave that because there are people who need it. And this is who Boaz naturally is. Before he knew anything about who Ruth was, he was following this law. And I don't want it to seem like, well, I mean, of course, you got to follow the law. There was no mechanism by which to force anybody to do this. There was no king. There were no rulers over individual cities or farmers that would go around and make sure they were doing this. So this really is a kindness on his part. It's a kindness that God has commanded. But he's saying, we want to be these kinds of people. We want to be generous, gracious people. And we see from the very beginning here that that's what Boaz is. But if we continue on in the story, after Ruth goes back, he says this to his workers, verse 15. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So the gracious thing, the kind thing, the thing that God wanted his people to do was to make sure that they are leaving something, not being greedy and taking everything, but leaving some. And Boaz was doing that, and that makes him a high character guy, because I'm sure there were plenty of people that weren't even doing that. But he goes to the next level and says, hey, I want you to take out some of the stuff you're gathering, and I'm sure the stuff that you're gathering that's in your seat, that's some of the best stuff. I want you to intentionally take it out. I want you to leave it there for her. I want her to have it. He goes above and beyond. And so the way that we'll say this is that Boaz is more than gracious. He's more than gracious. And so very early on, we see him reflecting the character of God, of not just simply being a generous person, but being even above and beyond the level of generous and kind that God required of his people. He wants to go the extra step. And so he looks at the people that are around him, and he says, they need this food. I'm going to leave it for them. And in fact, now that I see her and I know a little bit about her and her story, I want to make sure that we are going above and beyond. And so we see in Boaz this character. So there's what I feel I have to do, and he goes beyond that and even further beyond that to just being an incredibly gracious person. Now, I don't know about you. I mean, when you're having to pay like your property tax for your car, like you go, you get the thing, $50, $30, whatever, a car for the year. And then there's this thing at the end, voluntary tax. Do you ever notice that? It's like sometimes, like first couple of years after I did it, I wasn't smart enough to notice it. I just paid like everything it said on there. And then one day it was like, voluntary tax. And then, then all of a sudden you just kind of get especially the way I was raised. Like I get my back up. I was like, man, you're already taxing me too much. I'm not giving you voluntary tax. And but then now I've gotten to the point where now I feel guilty about it, right? So it's like, oh man, it seems like maybe they need the money. And like, I don't know if any of you guys are doing this or not. Maybe you are just great people. And then the same thing kind of happens, like you're at Walmart or whatever, and they're like, would you like to round up your total 82 cents in order to give to the thing? It's like, would you like one of these shamrocks and pay $1 and you can get the thing and we'll put it right here? And it's like everywhere all the time. People are just like, and I get the feeling that Boaz is just kind of one of these guys that's just like, sure, round it up. Sure. And I can only say that I would strive to be somebody like that. I mean, who doesn't seem to think anything beyond, I want to be a generous, gracious person. And I think we find ourselves in situations all the time with people in our neighborhood, friends, family members, people we work with, people we go to school with, that are having some sort of emotional or personal crisis of some kind, or we interact with people in our community who are having in some sort of physical or financial distress. And we always come up with reasons to not say yes. And then maybe we do say yes. And then there are those people. And these, I think, they're the kind of people that God is calling us to be, who just go above and beyond. When I see someone who is hurting, when I see someone who is in need, I will go above and beyond to just find a way to model and demonstrate the love and generosity of God to people. And so we got this guy Boaz, and we see him take a particular interest in Ruth. And I don't want to be naive and say that obviously part of this is he caught her eye, right? He noticed her, hey, who's that young woman? But he also verbalizes some things that help us understand beyond just maybe her youthfulness and attractiveness that made him want to be gracious with her. And this will be a review from last week, and then we'll get into the new passage. Verse 11, chapter 2. Boaz replied when asked by Ruth, why are you being so nice? I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel. under whose wings you have come to take refuge." So here she is. She's a widow, an orphan, and a foreigner. And she could have remedied all three of those things by just staying with her family. She would have a dad again. He would find another husband for her, and she would be in her homeland. But Boaz says, "I heard the story where you abandoned all of that out of your love and devotion to your mother-in-law, and I just can't help but be overwhelmed by the amount of faithfulness and kindness that you showed to her, and that's why I want to show this extra kindness to you." And so we continue in Ruth chapter 3. Ruth has been gathering there from Boaz's field for an undetermined amount of time. And then in Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 1, we have this interaction that Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi have. "One day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, 'My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking.'" Hold up, right? I mean, there's just kind of like what's going on here? It's like we need a husband, and I think Boaz can play this role. And we'll talk a little bit more about why Boaz and kind of what the implications of this were for the family. Basically, he says, hey, Boaz can be a really big help not only to you, but to me and you, and to our family, and to our future. And so here's what I want you to do. I mean, so it's the end of harvest, and he's going to be down there just kind of putting it all together and making food out of his harvest, and it's going to be kind of a celebration and a party. So what I want you to do, he's going to be in a really great mood celebrating after the harvest is over and kind of seeing what all he's got. And I want you to go down there. I want you to wear your best clothes. I want you to put on your best perfume. And I want you to go down there, and while he's eating and drinking and celebrating, you just hide out for now. And obviously, I mean, there's an eyebrow that's to be raised here, and it is perfectly fine for you to be like, what? And we've only just begun. Verse 4, "When he lies down, note the place where he is lying, then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. Now, I will get into kind of the saucy nature of this passage because I don't want to just brush past it. But the thing that I most want you to take note of is what Ruth says there at the end. "I will do whatever it is you ask." Just again, the dedication, the trust, the relationship, the love that she has for her mother-in-law. I will do whatever. So she's supposed to go down there in her best clothes, looking beautiful, smelling beautiful, and to go down, and when he lies down and goes to sleep, you go and uncover his feet and lay down there at his feet. Now, there is a significant amount of debate about what the phrase "uncover his feet" mean. The easiest, simple thing for us to do as Southerners who read in the Bible and we're in a group in church is just to be like, just take it at its face value. It's just pulling over his feet, it's kind of hung down his feet, it's no big deal. Just keep going. You're making me uncomfortable already just saying that there might be something else here, right? But the reality of it is, no matter what, everybody recognizes that is a very sensual thing that she's doing. Very erotic. There is beyond flirting that is going on there. There's something very sacred about feet at a minimum. But beyond that, a lot of people understand that this use of the word uncovering usually has the sense of which a denuding of someone, if you will. And that essentially what she did was expose him all the way up to his waist and then lay down at his feet. And again, there's not much suggesting that anything inappropriate here happened. But what I am saying is that this was a very forward, sensual gesture. Even to the point, again, I've already gone a half step too far. This is going to be 3 steps too far. Even to the point to where some people who really understand the Old Testament, its metaphors and its customs really well, basically say that he's going to wake up and he's exposed from the waist down, and he'll look at her at his feet, and what he will see as he's looking at her is the sign of the covenant that Abraham made. So the sign of the covenant exists right there, and he sees it, and he is reminded again of his obligation as a member of God's family. But regardless, let's just be very clear on this. This is a sensual moment. Continues, verse 7. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits. That's just a great line. Let's just enjoy the beauty of that line in the Bible. He was eating and drinking and was in good spirits, right? Okay, we'll just say that was from the celebration of the harvest, not from the eating and drinking, right? He was eating and drinking, but he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Okay, now we know, right? Like he is in such good spirits, he couldn't quite make it to bed. It was just, here's a pile of grain. I'm good here, right? Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. Right. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Who are you, he asked. I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Now, I've got a little bit of a preacher's dilemma here because there's just a lot of incredible awesomeness there in this passage about guardian redeemer and what this means. But a lot of this we're going to talk about next week too. But I hate the cliffhangery nature of this. I want to talk about all of it right now. But there's just a lot of great things here. And we'll talk about quite a few of them. And then if you feel unsatisfied, just come back next week and we'll keep talking about it. But essentially, the main thing that we want to get from here, both from the thing that he said earlier about why he was being kind to her by giving her extra grain, and what we see here is that what Boaz is doing is he's responding to Ruth's faithfulness. He's responding to her faithfulness and doing what she did. She comes to him and lies down there at his feet. He wakes up and says, will you put your garment over me as a symbol of protection? Will you be the guardian redeemer of my family? And what that means is it's a special place. And again, we're going to talk about this some today. We'll talk about it even more next week. Will you do this? Will you guard me? Will you protect me? And ultimately my family, which includes my mother-in-law, will you play this role in the life of our family? And Boaz says, this is incredible what you've done. This is incredible. And this is even more incredible than what you did before, was essentially the loyalty you showed to Naomi. You're like, why would he think that? Because it really seems more than her doing any great service. This is a romantic gesture that she's pursuing. But essentially what he's saying is, you chose me. You could have chosen or pursued or been pursued by any number of other younger men. And again, we get the impression here from this that there is an age gap between them and that she is attractive. And so he looks at her and says, you clearly could have gone after younger men. And he doesn't take that as a, I must be awesome kind of way. But he says he understands what she's doing in this guardian redeemer role. Because essentially with her coming to him as a cousin, he has a family obligation, if he's willing to do it, that God has established in the Old Testament for him to essentially take in Naomi and her extended family and essentially take the role of Elimelech, the dead dad. And so he is basically saying she could have gotten any husband she wanted, but she came after the one man who, if he took Ruth in, would be obligated to take Naomi in as well. Anybody else, if Ruth had gone there, it's like, well, Ruth, you just be my wife. It's, well, what do I care about your ex-husband's mom? That has nothing to do with me. You're my wife. But because he went through this guardian redeemer process, for him to take her as his wife is to make sure that her father-in-law that her mother-in-law, Naomi, is going to be able to be taken care of as well. And so again, what we see over and over again with Ruth is her just demonstrating faithfulness to God and love and devotion to Naomi. And this is how Boaz responds. He responds like when he sees this faithfulness, he's like, I will do this. He didn't initiate this process. But again, when she responds, when she initiates and makes this claim on him, he is so impressed by her faithfulness, her devotion to God, to her devotion to her mother-in-law, he responds. And ultimately what he does, and here's what we'll understand, kind of explain this process a little bit better. He brought her into God's family through a sacrifice. This was a sacrifice for Boaz. This is not just simply an older guy getting a trophy wife, right? I'm an old dude with a lot of money and a lot of land, and now I get to have this young wife. Look how, I mean, aren't we all, and I get this cool wife. It's not that. Essentially, by him being this guardian redeemer, he's essentially taking over this other family. And so, one, he has to buy this land back. And you think, well, that's not a sacrifice. He's buying land, and you buy land, you get land. But the land doesn't belong to him. It belongs to Elimelech, who is dead, and his descendants, his sons. Well, he doesn't have any sons. Well, that's where the next part goes. Ruth is going to have a son. And technically, biologically, it will be Boaz's son. But legally, it will be Elimelech's grandson, Ruth's first husband's son. So in the way that we would think about it, he has a son, but it gets her ex-husband's last name. And so he has a son, but it's not his son. And when this son grows up, that land becomes his. So the son he has isn't his. The land that he bought isn't his. He does all of this as a sacrifice, as an act of devotion and love, because to this family. I mean, I do not want to minimize the fact that I'm sure that he loved Ruth, that he was obviously attracted to her, but there is an incredible amount of sacrifice that is made as he is making a lot of personal sacrifice of taking what is his. He is going to raise this son ultimately to become his own family, and all of the things that he has bought and purchased and done is someone else's. And you may think, well, that's just a technicality. It's still his son. Well, you need to understand this culture. And this culture, he's not son of Boaz. This is not my son. This is not my land. But I am willing to sacrifice myself, all for the purpose of bringing Naomi and Ruth back into God's family. That is what he does. And I was not great in high school or even in college in literature classes. I wasn't any good at all. They talk about foreshadowing and imagery and all of these things and be like, I don't get it. It really wasn't until much later in life that something kind of clicked for me. I don't know if you're any better at it. I just ask this rhetorical question. I tell this story. Do you see Jesus? Does Jesus' name come to your mind as we're telling this story? Of a man who is more than gracious, who responds to faithfulness and sacrifices himself to bring on the outside of God's family, bringing those people into God's family. And so hundreds of years before Jesus is born, we see that it is very clear in this kinsman redeemer idea that God is putting the idea and the thought into the minds of his people. What sacrifice to bring people into God's family is to look like. The foreshadowing of Jesus. And so what we have here in Boaz is a real representation of who it is that Jesus is meant to be for all of us. This gracious man who, when we take a step towards him of faithfulness, He responds with this incredible sacrifice so that we can be a part of God's family. And so I want you to feel like Ruth again. As we've been admiring Boaz, I want you to feel like Ruth again. And recognize that Jesus has done this great thing for you. He has sacrificed his life. He laid down his privileges of being in heaven. He comes and sacrifices his life to no gain to him except to be in a relationship with you. And if you have experienced that before, I just ask you to just take some time and reflect and worship. If you haven't, man, I would just take some time. We're not here to be moral. We're not here to learn good teaching. That's not simply, this is primarily about being redeemed, about being restored and put into God's family through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And if you've never experienced that, our prayer and our hope would be that you would take some time today to allow that sacrifice for Jesus, not only just to become real, but to become personal for you. But at the same time, I want us to imagine all of us as Boazes as well. That we are his ambassadors. Essentially what the New Testament describes us as. We're Jesus' ambassadors. And when you are an ambassador, you take the values of the one that you serve and you take them to foreign places. And this is what God has called us to do. To take this value of sacrifice and love and grace and take it to people who are on the outside. So they can experience from me, and then ultimately that would draw them to Jesus. Let me pray for us.